welcome to my YouTube channel. It's Sophie. Today I'm going to go through 3 possible essay plans that you might want to use for a question like this. This style of question is a the best policy kind of essay question. It usually doesn't say it in such a simple way. Usually it's like a 4-line long question. Usually it's got twists and turns and makes it complicated. And actually sometimes you won't be able to use these particular essay plans because of the layers in the question and you will have to edit it. But hopefully I'll be able to provide you kind of a basic starter foundation from which to build from and apply any possible twists in the essay question. I'll also help clear you up on some of the downsides of writing in each of these ways. The plans aren't perfect and you might run into certain challenges. And hopefully this helps you think of what is the best style of plan for me to do for this particular question today. You also need to check maybe your exam board just to check there isn't anything specific that you will need to do. Okay, so I've simplified the question down just for the purpose of this video, but as you can see, the meaning of the question was kind of the same. With this plan A, the idea is we're going to find one policy and make it easy for yourself. Pick the policy in the question. So I think here the question was about taxation. Pick taxation, start with it, make it easy for you. And then you're going to find some drawbacks of that policy or why it might not work to solve obesity. Then you're going to suggest another policy, and that's going to become the basis of your next argument, and you're going to repeat those steps. So an introduction, I've discussed it before, isn't completely essential, but in this kind of question you probably want to define externalities, market failure, define maybe government intervention, anything that you find is helpful, but that's not really the focus. The focus is here we see in paragraph 2. Here I've suggested policy 1, which would be tax. In this case I'm going to explain how the tax reduces the problem of obesity, so you might say it increases average costs, reduces farms' ability to supply, increases prices, and in turn decreases quantity sold of these demerit goods, therefore reducing obesity, and as a result, any knock-on effects from that. Now with the evaluation, there are a few evaluation techniques that you could do. This isn't all of them. I've kind of grouped it into 2 main categories. Generally, a good style to do is to question the assumptions behind your essay, so why it might not reduce obesity. So you might doubt, for example, that the quantity will fall to the extent you said, because maybe the good is addictive or has very inelastic demand. And then the key thing is you want to suggest a second policy. So because tax might be placed on inelastic goods and therefore it might not reduce the quantity of these fast foods and therefore won't work very well, then I need to think of another policy. So I might say, okay, something that can certainly solve the quantity of fast food sold is maybe age requirements. Maybe you will only be allowed to have fast food if you're over 18 or over 16 or something. So based on that logic, the next set of policies to scrutinize is the age requirements. And then you repeat the process. You say, okay, by limiting fast food to 16-year-olds or 18-year-olds plus, you are preventing the consumption of these demerit goods to children who are growing and developing healthy eating habits. As a result, you'll have less quantity to consume for sure because they can't buy this product, so therefore it doesn't create the obesity and the problems. And again, you want to question the assumption, so you could say, well, you might still get people cooking unhealthy at home, or maybe the parents could still buy the food for the children. There are other ways to evaluate this. You'll see in some of the other plans. I'm not going to go into that in particular detail for now, but the idea is suggest your policy 3, so something that maybe tackles the diets of the parents could be quite useful. So you might want to suggest, okay, to reduce obesity, instead maybe you want to provide education or even free cooking classes for parents to sign up and help improve the health of the family in general. This time you won't need to probably suggest another policy because you've already said 3. Instead you go into the conclusion, you directly answer the question saying, okay, overall I've taken a look at tax, age requirements, and these education classes. They all can work to reduce obesity. Overall, the flaws of the tax were very clear, that it might not work for inelastic products. Age requirements seem to assist with that, but aren't, again, everything. And then try and directly answer the question. Overall, it seems like this is the best policy to reduce obesity. You must tackle the best policy. And you have considered 3. So that's kind of a lot of arguments. Now this directly answers the question fairly well, kind of well. You run a risk of your essay talking about the flaws of tax and the flaws of each one. And so you don't give enough consideration maybe to how they are unique and uniquely beneficial. So your essay could be a little bit biased. You may not have chosen the strongest policies either. So I've picked age requirements and education simply because I knew that was a problem with the other ones. But maybe these aren't the most effective ways to solve obesity. Maybe instead research and development could be the best. I just haven't seen it as a flaw, so I haven't suggested it. So your essay could be a bit biased, and the conclusion can be a bit biased because it's based on flaws. So there's a lack of consideration on the negatives and the positives of each policy. So then you might want to do a plan B, which is the strategy of just take each policy separately, argue each of them as neutrally as possible, look at both sides of the story, and then in the conclusion start to answer the question. So I'm not going to talk about the introduction, but here you might want to talk about, okay, so a tax you could implement, go with what's suggested in the question is much easier. Increases average cost, reduces the quantity because the price is higher, reducing obesity. And then you might say might not do it because maybe there are some goods that are inelastic, as we've said. And you might even mention some of the costs, which is really great. We haven't emphasized that so far yet. So you might say, and in addition, maybe it could create inequality to some degree or so on. Then you have a really balanced argument that's looked at how tax could work and how tax couldn't work and the possible unintended consequences that could actually make it overall a harmful policy. And then you repeat this for the other policies. And this is great because then you've taken each one in turn and you've looked at everything about it. But then the conclusion is where you've got to get your game on. Here is the really important part. If you notice, so far you haven't answered the question. You have not answered what is the best policy yet at all. You've just looked at how tax will reduce it, how something else will reduce it, and how policy 3 will reduce it and why they might not. So this is the most important part. This is where you have to write a really long conclusion, actually comparing tax, comparing policy 2, comparing policy 3. So you'll actually have to be doing extra stuff that you haven't been doing so far and synthesizing arguments together. So directly answer the question, compare each policy, consider whether the benefits outweigh the costs, explain your reasoning step by step, and then say, okay, tax is the best policy because even though it could raise prices, it generates lots of money and that money could be used to fund all these education schemes, and it also will help to reduce the quantity somewhat. Something like this. So there are some really strong benefits of writing in this way. It's really easy to structure, you just need one paragraph on each. So there's not much time or thinking required to structure it. It also requires the least upfront theory. you can learn a lot about tax as you write it, and you're like, oh, that's what makes it great, that's what makes it powerful for this particular essay. But at the same time, your answer to the question only emerges in the conclusion. That's so risky. If you're the type of writer that maybe runs out of time, then that's going to mean you don't want to risk suddenly, writing this whole long essay, running out of time and scoring a very low mark because you haven't actually answered the question. Maybe it would have been better for you to do the other plan style, to just have like a backup plan that if I were to run out of time, I know that, okay, I've somewhat answered the question already. So that's really a big downside. You have to be really time confident, or doing this maybe in a homework essay. The conclusion will have to be very long. You have to really do some extra stuff you haven't done before. And honestly, that might mean that you've got a lot of material about taxes and things that end up not being useful, that end up not being relevant arguments to your essay. It's very easy to drift away, to talk about everything you know about tax, but actually what matters more is whether tax is better than something else. Nevertheless, you've looked at the positives and the negatives of each, so your essay is less likely to be biased. Maybe it's not so useful, maybe it's not so relevant, but at least it's maybe thorough. And then we get Plan C. Now, Plan C is a challenging plan to do, but it's a bit different, so let's talk through what happens. Here, you're going to, in your first paragraph, talk about all the policies you're going to suggest and how they reduce obesity. Now, this is, you'll have to talk about tax, you'll have to talk about age limits, and then you'll have to talk about, I forgot what the other policy is. You'll have to talk about, I don't know, some other kind of regulation. You'll have to talk about all of those and how they solve obesity, the problem of obesity, so the market failure of obesity, with the, the merit good graph, all of that in your first paragraph. It's going to be a really long paragraph. You have to try your best to not let it get so long, because that's not really the focus of the question. It's kind of long enough to get you happy and clear with how they are different and how they work differently. In fact, maybe even paragraph 1 isn't super essential, and some of the writers in this video who are more confident might be able to reduce this step significantly, or even move on from it and actually launch straight into the next bit. So then with paragraph 2, you would talk about, okay, my policy of tax may be better than age requirements and regulation because it does something unique. So it generates revenue, which can be used to pay for the regulations and all the other kinds of intervention, which is your argument of why it might work better. But then you should question the logic behind that. So question the idea that, well, it might not generate so much revenue as I had claimed, maybe because it's easy to avoid the particular thing that's being taxed. Or maybe it has significant costs that even though it generates lots of revenue, actually it does it in a super harmful way, and it wasn't really worth trying to reduce obesity in that way. Then you want to look at the other policies. So what you have to do to this question is you have to prove why something else might be better. So it doesn't really matter whether you take policy 2 or policy 3. You could take one of them or both of them and just come up with one reason why age requirements or regulation might be better. So you might say, well, the problems of obesity are most significant when it affects children. So in that case, the age limits are the best way because they ensure that that most vulnerable group isn't being impacted negatively, and the lifelong consequences from that. And again, question the assumptions, or question whether that could have some significant costs that make it overall a bad policy to pick. And then in your conclusion, you've already done a lot of the work already. You've already, looked at whether tax is better, whether age limits are better. And so you just tie that together, tie up all your reasoning, and say overall, okay, it seems like age limits are better, given that the problems of obesity are mainly caused in the, I don't know, but in that particular age group. The problem with this style of writing is it's really, really difficult. You have to know a lot about the policies to be able to compare them all together without having really fully developed each of your reasoning into how tax works, into how age things work. Although it's really good because it's really directly answering the question. So if you feel you're going to run out of time and you know your theory really well, this maybe could be a good choice for you. It's also a balanced argument. You're looking at both policies, you're looking why they both might be better than each other and why they might not be better. Another downside is that first paragraph, it's a fine balancing act. That first paragraph could get too long and you can run out of time. You have to do just enough so that you can come up with some reasons as to why one might be better than another one. So that first paragraph is really not the focus of this essay. The focus of this essay is what comes up with what is better than one or the other. You might also find some of your chains of reasoning are duplicated. And this is something that you have to continue. When you get better at essay planning and essay writing, you might spend like a minute before you actually write the essay, just kind of imagining what could be the problems if I write this. And if you do think that there are going to be significant duplications, you should do something about that because that's wasting your time. So hopefully that was really helpful. You can download the sample essay plans below. Be sure to update it and apply it really carefully to the style of question that you've been given. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.